Let me begin with a simple but powerful question. What happens when celebration blinds a nation to the realities of war? Because this week, geopolitics gave us a stunning reminder that conflict doesn't pause for holidays, parades, or patriotic ceremonies. The global stage watched in shock as Ukraine waited for Russia to enter a moment of national celebration. Then, executed one of the largest coordinated strikes on Moscow since the war began. This is not merely a military event. It is an economic story, a political message, and a turning point reflecting deeper global tensions. And that is what we must unpack today. Ukraine's strategic timing in launching its largest strike on Moscow represents one of the most calculated maneuvers of the entire conflict, and understanding that timing reveals far more than the surface-level headline. At its core, this action was not simply a military response. It was a deliberate psychological operation designed to expose vulnerabilities at a moment when Russia least expected it. Imagine the scene, a nation absorbed in celebration, projecting unity and national pride, broadcasting images of stability to both domestic and international audiences. This is the very moment Ukraine chose to act, and that choice carries a powerful message. It says, in effect, even at your highest moment, we can reach you. Such timing is more than symbolic. It is strategic theater designed to shift both perception and power. War is rarely about brute force alone. It is a contest of intelligence, timing, pressure, and narrative dominance. Ukraine understood that striking during a period of Russian celebration would not only disrupt military operations, but also pierce the psychological armor that national festivities attempt to reinforce. Russia's celebrations are curated to display command and control, an image of a government in full authority. By launching a major strike during such a moment, Ukraine exposed the fragility behind that image. The hook here is simple. Sometimes the most powerful blow is the one that disrupts the story a nation tells about itself. This timing also forces the international community to revisit assumptions about the war's trajectory. Key global players, Washington, Brussels, Beijing, watch for signals, and Ukraine's move broadcast a bold one. The conflict is no longer confined to the predictable rhythms of battlefield exchange. Ukraine is willing to reshape those rhythms entirely. The psychological shock extends beyond Moscow's borders, influencing diplomatic calculations, altering aid debates, and reminding allies that hesitation has consequences. Economically, this timing deepens pressure as well. Russian markets react not only to explosions, but to the fear of unpredictability. Investors and institutions do not fear conflict as much as they fear disruption when they least expect it. By choosing a moment of celebration, Ukraine attacked not just infrastructure, but confidence in stability, security, and continuity. Most importantly, this action underscores Ukraine's evolving sophistication in understanding the intersection of war, narrative, and global perception. The strike was not merely an act of retaliation. It was a demonstration of strategic maturity, showing that timing can amplify impact more powerfully than scale alone. And it sends a clear signal. No moment, no symbol, no celebration is insulated from the realities of war when strategy becomes sharper than the weapons themselves. Scale and precision of this strike mark a profound escalation in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, one that pushes the boundaries of what both nations and the international community previously believed possible. When an attacked nation demonstrates the ability not only to reach the capital of its adversary, but to do so with coordinated force, it signals a dramatic shift in capabilities, confidence, and intent. This is not simply another chapter in the war. It is a moment that redefines the parameters of the conflict. And the hook here is unmistakable. When a smaller nation successfully penetrates the symbolic heart of a global power, the world pays attention, not because it happened, but because of what it now makes possible. This escalation shows that Ukraine is no longer operating purely in defensive survival mode. The decision to target Moscow and on this scale reflects an assertive transition into strategic offense. This type of operation suggests improved intelligence, stronger international backing, enhanced technological capabilities, and a refined understanding of Russia's blind spots. In modern warfare, escalation is not judged solely by the number of missiles launched, but by the sophistication of execution and the psychological weight it carries. And here, the psychological weight is enormous. Ukraine is signaling that it will not be confined to predictable battlegrounds or limited expectations. From Russia's perspective, this kind of strike challenges not just military infrastructure, but the very architecture of its national image. Moscow is not merely a city, it is the political center, the cultural symbol, and the seat of Russian power. When a strike reaches that level, it forces the Kremlin into a defensive narrative, something it rarely wants to entertain. The blow is not only physical, it penetrates the aura of invulnerability Russia has long projected, and that is a hook the world cannot ignore. The moment a capital becomes vulnerable, the war becomes something different, more complex, more unstable, and more consequential. On the global stage, this escalation reverberates far beyond Moscow and Kyiv. Allies now reevaluate their commitments. Opponents reassess their strategies. Neutral nations reconsider their positions. This kind of strike invites questions about red lines, thresholds, and the risk of further destabilization in an already volatile region. If Ukraine can escalate strategically, what does that mean for NATO boundaries, for European security frameworks, for global energy markets? The answers ripple outward, influencing decisions in Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and beyond. In essence, Ukraine's move demonstrates that the conflict has entered a new, more unpredictable phase, one in which symbolism, technological capability, and strategic audacity carry as much weight as territorial control. And in that shift, the world is left with a single compelling truth. When escalation breaks expectations, it reshapes the entire conflict. Psychological warfare has always been a silent force shaping global conflict, but Ukraine's strike on Moscow highlights just how decisive that force can be. This action was not designed solely to damage infrastructure. It was designed to shake confidence both inside Russia and across the international stage. When a strike pierces the psychological core of a nation, its impact can exceed the physical damage by magnitudes. And here lies a powerful hook. In modern warfare, fear, uncertainty, and perception can be more destabilizing than any explosive. Ukraine's decision to target Moscow goes far beyond the battlefield. It challenges the controlled narrative that Russia has carefully maintained, one in which its capital stands untouchable and its leadership operates from a position of absolute security. By violating that perceived distance, Ukraine forces a reckoning within Russia's own population. If the heart of the nation can be reached, what else is suddenly possible? What else is suddenly vulnerable? Psychological warfare thrives on these questions, and Ukraine's strike ensures they echo loudly across Russian society. At the leadership level, the psychological implications are even deeper. Governments rely on the perception of control, stability, and security. When a rival disrupts that perception, leaders are pushed toward political defensiveness, compelled to explain, justify, and respond. Ukraine is not only targeting physical structures, it is targeting Russia's internal confidence, forcing the Kremlin to confront its own fragilities in front of a watchful world. That creates pressure that can affect decision-making, diplomacy, public sentiment, and the overall trajectory of the war. Psychological warfare also operates on another, more subtle level. It influences allies and adversaries watching from afar. Nations that support Ukraine see this strike as a demonstration of resilience and capability, reinforcing the belief that aid is impactful and the Ukrainian cause remains viable. Meanwhile, Russian partners and neutral states observe the breach of Moscow's symbolic shield and begin questioning the long-term stability of Russia's position. Here is the hook. When a capital city shows cracks, even political allies start looking for escape routes. The global public is equally affected. Media coverage of such a strike alters the narrative from a distant conflict to a dynamic confrontation capable of surprising turns. Public opinion, which shapes foreign policy in democratic nations, becomes more engaged, more aware, and more invested. Psychological warfare works not only on soldiers and leaders, but on populations. A reminder that wars today are broadcast, analyzed, and emotionally consumed in real time. By reaching Moscow, Ukraine demonstrated that the battlefield is no longer defined by geography alone. It is defined by belief, by perception, and by the emotional reactions triggered around the world. And once psychological warfare takes hold, its effects ripple far beyond the strike itself, reshaping expectations, rewriting narratives, and altering the balance of power in ways that no weapon alone could ever achieve. The economic dimension of Ukraine's strike on Moscow is far more significant than the immediate damage reported on the ground. In fact, the true impact lies in how the attack disrupts Russia's financial confidence, investor psychology, and the broader perception of economic stability. When the political and economic center of a nation becomes a target, the message is unmistakable. Even the strongest economic hubs are not immune to disruption, and this is the hook that resonates across global markets. Uncertainty spreads faster than any missile ever could. Moscow is not just another city, it is the engine of Russia's financial system. It houses major banks, corporate headquarters, energy firms, and critical government institutions that shape national economic policy. When a strike reaches that core, even if the physical infrastructure remains largely intact, the shock reverberates through financial circuits. Investors immediately factor in new levels of risk. Markets respond not only to the explosion, but to the fear that it represents a new phase of unpredictability. In economics, perception is power, and Ukraine's strike directly challenges Russia's long-standing projection of economic resilience. For Russia's internal economy, the timing and location of the strike create a secondary effect, a surge in domestic anxiety. Consumers, businesses, and financial institutions begin questioning the reliability of state protection. Anxiety influences spending habits, investment decisions, and long-term planning. The Kremlin can attempt to reassure, but economic confidence is not commanded. It is earned, and once shaken, it is difficult to restore quickly. This is why the strike has an economic weight that far exceeds its physical footprint. The hook here is direct and potent. Uncertainty is the enemy of economic stability, and Ukraine just introduced a wave of it. Internationally, the consequences are equally notable. Global markets, especially energy, wheat, and commodities tied to the region, react to the possibility that the conflict could escalate further. Any instability involving Russia forces energy markets to brace for disruptions, and even the suggestion of risk can move prices. European economies, already strained by years of conflict-related pressures, now watch closely for signs that the war could spill into new strategic domains. The strike signals to the world that neither side is backing down, and that new economic tensions may emerge as the conflict evolves. This escalation also influences how nations calculate the cost of involvement. Supporters of Ukraine see a nation willing to strike strategically and create leverage, which strengthens the case for continued financial and military assistance. Conversely, countries maintaining trade relationships with Russia rethink their long-term investments and political engagements. In the arena of global economics, perception shifts can quietly reshape alliances and trade patterns. Ukraine's strike demonstrates that modern warfare is as much an economic contest as it is a military one. The message is unmistakable. If you disrupt the heart of a nation's economic power, you disrupt its confidence, its stability, and its ability to project strength. And that single moment of disruption can alter the economic landscape far beyond the immediate blast. The global ripple effects of Ukraine's strike on Moscow extend far beyond the borders of either nation, shaping geopolitical calculations in ways that are immediate, complex, and deeply consequential. When a conflict reaches the symbolic heart of a major world power, the entire international system is forced to reassess its expectations. Governments, intelligence agencies, financial institutions, and diplomatic bodies all begin recalibrating their assumptions. This is the hook that defines the moment. When one strike forces the world to rethink its own stability, the conflict stops being regional and becomes unmistakably global. For NATO, this event triggers a new level of strategic reflection. The alliance has spent years balancing support for Ukraine with the risk of provoking Russia into broader escalation. A successful strike on Moscow changes the equation. It signals that Ukraine has both the capability and the boldness to reshape the dynamics of the conflict. And that introduces new questions for Western policymakers. Should support be increased to capitalize on Ukraine's momentum, or should caution be amplified to prevent further destabilization? These are not theoretical debates. They influence budgets, sanctions, military planning, and diplomatic negotiations across Europe and North America. Meanwhile, the United States, long the primary financial and military supporter of Ukraine, faces renewed debates at home. A strike on the Russian capital can either strengthen the argument for continued aid, showing Ukraine's resilience and effectiveness, or intensify calls for restraint from those worried about escalating into direct confrontation with a nuclear power. In Washington, every bold moment on the battlefield becomes a political moment in Congress. The hook is unmistakable. A single shockwave in Moscow can ripple straight into U.S. legislative chambers. European nations feel the pressure differently. For them, the conflict is not across an ocean, but at their doorstep. Energy markets shift, migration pressures evolve, and security protocols tighten each time the war takes a new turn. Countries like Germany, Poland, and France must reconsider defense commitments, economic exposure, and diplomatic positioning. The strike on Moscow adds urgency, reminding Europe that the war's trajectory remains unpredictable and that their own stability is intertwined with the decisions made in Kyiv and Moscow. Beyond the West, global powers like China, India, and Middle Eastern nations also reassess their strategies. Many of these countries maintain complex economic and political relationships with Russia. A strike on Moscow introduces new uncertainties about Russia's long-term strength and reliability as a partner. Nations that pursue pragmatic neutrality now face new pressures to rethink their calculations. The global South, too, is affected as food prices, energy costs, and trade routes respond to the heightened tension. Even international institutions are forced into new postures. The United Nations, already constrained in its ability to influence the conflict, must confront a renewed sense of urgency. Global markets adjust expectations, humanitarian agencies adjust forecasts, and diplomatic envoys reconsider peace negotiations. The world is reminded that modern conflict does not remain trapped in a single region. It reverberates across continents, economies, and political landscapes. Ukraine's strike on Moscow proves a simple but profound truth. In a globalized world, even a single military action can reshape international order, challenge alliances, and force nations everywhere to confront the reality that this conflict is far from contained. The shift toward narrative warfare has become one of the most defining features of modern conflict, and Ukraine's strike on Moscow demonstrates just how powerful this dimension has become. In today's world, battles are no longer fought only on the ground. They're fought on screens, in headlines, and across global perceptions. Every action is crafted not just to achieve military results, but to shape the story the world tells about the conflict. And that is the hook at the center of this moment. The side that controls the narrative often gains as much power as the side that controls territory. Ukraine's decision to strike Moscow was not only a tactical maneuver, it was an intentional disruption of Russia's storytelling. For years, Moscow has projected an image of strength, stability, and near invulnerability. The capital, in particular, stands as the core symbol of that narrative. When Ukraine reaches deep into that symbolic center, it does far more than damage structures. It fractures the story Russia tells its own people and the world about who holds control. Narrative warfare thrives exactly in these fractures, where perception becomes more influential than physical impact. This shift transforms the conflict into a communication battle as much as a military one. Ukraine's strike sends a message not just to Russia, but to international audiences who are constantly evaluating the legitimacy, strength, and determination of each side. The world watches through the lens of media, and each headline amplifies or challenges the narratives being constructed. Ukraine uses this moment to position itself as resilient, capable, and strategically savvy, an underdog that can reach where few believed it could. That image, strengthened by bold actions, increases global sympathy, boosts diplomatic leverage, and justifies continued support from allies. Meanwhile, Russia is forced into reactive storytelling. Every narrative advantage Ukraine gains is a narrative burden Russia must counter, not only for foreign audiences, but for its own citizens. A strike on Moscow demands an explanation, a defense, and a justification. Leaders must maintain confidence even when reality challenges that confidence. This is where narrative warfare becomes as heavy as any battlefield blow. When a government is compelled to defend its image, it reveals the strain behind the scenes. Allies and adversaries alike monitor these narrative shifts closely. Nations supporting Ukraine see a story of strength that reinforces their investments. Countries on the fence interpret Ukraine's action as evidence that Russia's grip may not be as firm as projected. Even nations aligned with Russia must reconsider how this strike influences the balance of global influence. In narrative warfare, perception is currency, and Ukraine just increased its value at a moment of maximum visibility. The global public, too, becomes an active participant. In an era where information spreads instantly, the emotional response of populations across continents affects political decisions, aid policies, and diplomatic pressure. This is why narrative warfare is so potent. It moves hearts before it moves armies. And once hearts move, governments often follow. Ukraine's strike proves that modern conflict is no longer defined solely by firepower. It is defined by who tells the most compelling story, who controls the emotional momentum, and who can shape global opinion with precision and purpose. Narrative warfare has become a battlefield of its own, and in this moment, Ukraine seized the narrative with both hands.